This is WZAY-LP, Rockledge, Florida, FM 92.9.
You're flying solo. No, I was looking at you. Okay. All right, it's time to get started tonight. By way of announcement, men's breakfast is Saturday, 9 a.m. at Kay's. By way of people, Robert is still in the hospital, getting ready, I think, to get toward rehab, be there for at least a couple of weeks, and then hopefully he's able to walk again, get to go back home at some point, so keep Robert in your prayers. I got a handout down here. It says, Bill and Lovey Piggott, still multiple health issues. So maybe on February 29th, one of them will be healthy, because it just seems like always something going on with one of the Piggotts. Feel bad for them. Supposed to come to Florida from West Virginia to get better, aren't you? Coming down here is supposed to help that. They went the other direction for them. So, and Tammy is going to be. Well, she didn't look mad when I just said her name. She just kind of rolled her shoulders at me. Roll them at him, because he's the one that told me. Okay, but then she rolled her shoulders at me and looking at me, and she does that. Well, I just got treated like. Anyway, you can talk to Tammy about what's happening to her eyes shortly, because if I say it out loud, that she's going to have surgery here soon. There we go. Now Don said it. Don said it out loud. Anybody else? Rick? Okay. There we go. Let's keep Denise in our prayers as well. That is all that I have. So let's enter into our devotional period.
Please take a songbook out of the rack in front of you. And first turn to number 907, Hark the Gentle Voice, and place your marker there. Again, mark number 907, Hark the Gentle Voice. And we'll sing that as our invitation song in just a few minutes. Once you have 907 marked, please turn to number 753, farther along. Number 753. We'll sing all three verses of this song. Then we'll have our opening prayer and our devotion.
Never boldness. Most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you at this time. Thank you for the many blessings you bestow upon us and the grace that you bestowed upon us and the Son you gave us so that we might have hope for salvation. We're grateful for all those things and knowing that you are in control and that you understand us and understand our needs. As we go through life, we ask you to bless us, and this congregation especially, we ask you to be with a number of the individuals that are in various states of health that need special attention. We're thankful for the many times that you've helped us and been with us and given us the strength to go on, and we ask you to continue doing that and be with the families of the people that have health problems, because they need that extra strength too, so they can support the individuals. We ask you to bless us as we go into the study of your word tonight and guide us that we might obtain the utmost knowledge and understanding that we can take into the world with us so that we can do your work. We ask you all these things in Christ's name. Amen.
As I was listening to that song, Farther Along, I was just thinking when I was in my 30s, I had no idea what that really meant. And as we get older and we begin thinking about those things, farther along, the closer we get to heaven, it is a joyful time to be thinking about for sure. Tonight, I want to take just a minute as we offer an invitation to talk about filling the gaps, something that I believe is important for all of us as Christians. Said through Ezekiel, "So I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found no one." To understand that a little bit, we need to understand what it was like back in the old days, the Old Testament. We all have heard the stories of Jericho and the walls. Well, all the cities pretty much back in those days had walls of some kind. And those walls were to protect the people within the walls. And they would keep soldiers, the best soldiers, on top of the walls to fight the enemy. But over time, either cracks or whatever would happen, the walls would begin to form gaps and come apart, and the enemy would use those gaps to be able to get in to pillage and to kill inside the fortress of the city. And that's what God was talking about, only he was talking about the spiritual gaps that had come within the nation of Israel. And those gaps were brought about by sinful people that had turned away from God and were focused on themselves. They had spiritually lost all of their understanding of who God was to some degree. They kept his laws. They acted like they were good people, but all they did was steal from the people. They lied to the people, the leaders I'm talking about. And because of that, spiritual gaps came about, and as we all know, because Ezekiel wrote this from captivity in Babylon, that the nation of Israel was taken over and destroyed. But the good thing about Ezekiel and his letter is he lets it be known, or God lets it be known through Ezekiel, that there is hope. And the nation he was not done with the people of Israel. And they would again have an opportunity to turn to him, which we know some did, most didn't, down the road, because it was he was talking about the coming of the true kingdom, the kingdom we know. But the key I wanted to mention this evening was this. There are gaps in our walls today, And I'm not talking about this church or people. I'm just talking about in the Lord's church. We have to be very cautious. There are not gaps in the walls. As a nation, there are gaps locally, nationally. We see that in all the problems that are going on in the country. There's gaps in the homes where parents they're too busy to stand up for what is truly right. We see gaps in our country where evil has corrupted the minds of men and women, and we've lost our focus, our focus being God. We have turned away and we have lost that focus, and we have allowed gaps to spiritually crack our walls. And the enemy is coming in, and it's up to we as God's people to stand in those gaps and to be the people that God wants us to be. He's looking for gap standers. So I'm asking all of us tonight to think about that and to become in some way, some fashion, however you can do it, whatever God takes you into or opens your mind to do, to become a gap stander for God, because He is asking that today, just as He talked about it, or just as He spoke through Ezekiel. We have an opportunity at this time to offer an invitation to, if you've not accepted Jesus Christ, which I believe most of us have, but if you haven't, we have an opportunity to come forward at this time to accept Him, put Him on in baptism for the remission of your sins, and to turn your life around and live a life for Christ. Or if you need prayers of the congregation, if someone is in need of those prayers, we have this opportunity at this time to come forward. So if you would, please come to the front as we stand and as we sing.
Dismissed for your classes.
What's that? Give me another 2 or 3 minutes and I'll be ready to go. All right. It's in the Old Testament somewhere, right? There we go. The problem is my Bible program, in abbreviating the words, abbreviates Esther, E-S, and Ecclesiastes, E-C. You would think after all the years I could figure out pretty quickly which one of those books I want. And it doesn't help that, of course, every book around it is abbreviated, and it's not always in the same spot because it changes by the page. So it's really troubling to me when I have to try and find it. So anyway, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, which is funny. I just opened my Bible to Ezekiel. Just needed another E letter in there. All right. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. In chapter 8, well, let me just give you kind of the front end and the back end of it by looking at the first verse and the last verse. At the first verse, Solomon says, "Who is wise and who knows the interpretation of the thing?" And then kind of in the second half of that verse, makes it sound like a man that's wise is your best bet. Okay? Get down to the last verse of chapter 8, verse number 17, and the very last half of that verse says, however much man may toil in seeking, he will not find out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot know it. So it's kind of beginning and ending of the chapter. We got the same chapter ends, kind of antithetical to where it begins. It starts with an affirmation of, hey, better to go hunting and be wise, and it ends up by saying, well, I guess that's better, because that was our word. Remember last week we looked at chapter 7, how often the word better comes up throughout chapter 7, and then he gets to chapter 8, and effectively, it's better to be wise, but when we get to the end of this, it still doesn't really make much of a difference. So, chapter 8, in a lot of ways, from a teaching standpoint, it's a little bit difficult of a chapter in that there's not really a lot new in it. A lot of the things that are said here, the formatting of them, the correlation of them is perhaps different than other parts of the book. But if you take the points here that are individual, guess what? You can just about on every verse say, okay, that verse is found in this chapter. So it's not really necessarily a conclusion. That really starts maybe in chapter 9 through chapter 12 is obviously the conclusion. But we get to chapter 9, we do change topic a little bit, or perspective more so than topic a little bit, and you start to work toward the conclusion with more, again, practical advice going forward. Chapter 8, though, kind of serves, in my mind as I read through chapter 8, just kind of as a final point to all the things that have been said to this point. And it focuses primarily on, wisdom, which for Solomon's writings makes perfect sense. That's what he's known for. That's what Solomon obviously received from God and so on. That theme, while the major theme of the book, of course, is vanity of vanities, all is vanity, trying to answer the question about what does a man profit for all his labor under the sun, looking at all the things that he just refers to as a striving after the wind. That's the main theme of it. The thing that we keep coming back to, again, because this comes from Solomon, is the impact that wisdom can have. And this is probably, although we're not done with wisdom, it'll come back up as we continue to read through. This may be let me call it the penultimate chapter, kind of dealing with wisdom. And it just really builds upon a lot that goes before it. The method by which it is done, not exclusively through the chapter, but primarily through the chapter, is a man's relationship to his king. Okay? And that's where we start in the very opening verses of the chapter, about how do you deal with your king? And of course, the answer is going to be, if you're going to be in front of the king, is it better to be a wise man or to be a fool? Well, it doesn't take a whole lot of figuring out there to figure out, okay, if you're going to be in front of the king, it's better to be wise than to be a fool. But while it might be better to be wise in front of the king, guess what that does not make you? It does not make you the king. Okay, and that is one of the themes that we're going to see through chapter 8. Even to the wise man, while that's better, it still doesn't negate the fact that he's the king and you're not. All right? So, let's start looking through the chapter 8 together as we move in that direction. In this chapter, as we just noted, we rushed through the end of chapter 7 last week because it's quite a bit longer. Let's start up maybe about like verse 27 of chapter 7, kind of as the introductory thought to chapter 8, because chapter 8 brings back up that thing that we talked about last week, that idea of not being able to find out or having not found. We just noticed it at the end of chapter 8, verse 17. We just read that phraseology together. But that, again, it's multiple times in chapter 7, and it comes back in chapter 7, verse 28. So in 27 it says, "Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things." So I'm piecing this together, working it out. He says, "My soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found." So trying to figure everything out, couldn't do it. And he said, "Here's the problem. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found." Okay? Keep in mind, this is poetic language. I don't think he is making, as we said last week, I don't think he is making an unequivocal gender difference between the righteousness/wisdom of men and women because of what he says in the phrase that follows. It's just hyperbolic, poetic language, essentially saying, I've been trying to find all things together, and basically what is it that I found? Nothing. Okay? It's 1 in 1,000. We might even say 1 in a million to get it right. He said it doesn't exist, effectively, is what he's saying. And then he says this in the second half, verse 29, but notice what he said in 28, twice, I have not found, I have not found. And then in 29 he says, see, this alone is what I did find. This alone I found. God made man upright, okay, but they, and I think that they is properly translated there, but if you in your brain at least you thought of the word they both or them both, would kind of give you the sense of the meaning of the verse. Because what has he just talked about in the phrases that preceded it? Men and women. Okay? I looked through all of humanity, man and woman, and what did I find? Well, God made them upright, but they have sought out a whole lot of different schemes. Okay? That's in the background of what is about to follow. All right? So, chapter 8, verse 1, he then asks the question, who is wise? Or who is like the wise, rather, and who knows the interpretation of the thing. Interesting word. It's about only used a couple times in the Old Testament. It is used in Daniel 5 when Daniel talks about finding the interpretation of dreams. It's just a rare word that's used there. It's here. But who is able to basically to ascertain things? The whole thought is, what can I find? I'm trying to find things. Who's going to be able to find out something? Who's going to know the interpretation of all of the things that are going on? And then he says, a man's wisdom makes his face to shine. Okay? And the hardness of his face, it says, is changed. Again, if you probably have some marginal notes or some cross references in your Bible with other verses that this phraseology is not unique to Solomon, that you can find it other places about a man's face to shine, and the hardness of his face has been changed. Just the same idea that let's see if I can pull up one that I noted. Number 625. Number 625 says, the Lord makes his face to shine upon you. Okay? So when the Lord does that, he makes his face shine upon you. Take that in a generic context. That's a good thing, right? Okay, what do you know about the Lord when his face is shining upon you? When his goodness is towards you? Well, you know a lot of things. We could have a long theological discussion about all the things that could mean. But the application of it here in this context is about what, specifically? Well, what kind of man are we talking about? Talking about a wise man. So if you apply that language to God in the same kind of context, when you look and God's face is shining upon you, what do you know He knows? Well, everything. He knows it all. You're talking to the one who's got all the answers. So here's this wise man. His appearance is good. His face is shining. That hardness, that inability to make adaptations or changes, whatever you don't do that with that imagery. He says wisdom. Solomon knows that's the best answer you've got to getting through it. Okay, so that's where we start in chapter 8. Being wise, boy, that's a really good thing. No one is like the wise man. All right? So he says in verse 2, I say, keep the king's command. Okay? Keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Marginal note in the ESV says you can render that last phrase because of your oath to God. And again, depending on your translation, you may actually have that rendering or some variant of that rendering there. Again, my knowledge of Hebrew lasts about 3 seconds, but in the research I did on that verse, it seems like either can be a perfectly good translation of that phraseology. I don't know, from an expositional standpoint, it does matter which is the right rendering of it, but from an application standpoint, I don't know that it makes that much difference to it. Because particularly when Solomon's writing this, who determines who the king is? Well, God does, because he's writing as the king of Israel. The king is the king of Israel. Okay? And God did make an oath to Solomon, made an oath to David that preceded that, had made some oaths to Saul that did not end up well for Saul, but certainly to Solomon, there were oaths there, actually a couple of oaths to Solomon that go with it. So that would be a doctrinally perfectly good rendering of that verse. You obey the king's command because you need to remember of God's oath to him. But you should also remember, you should do that because, well, you are a member, you would likely be, the recipient of this book is going to be a citizen of the nation of Israel. Guess why you need to obey your king? Well, that's the other rendering of it, because of your oath to God. So however you phrase that in whatever translation you're using, however it's rendered, both make a very valid point, or a point consistent with the argument that Solomon is making. Better to be wise here. And part of that is not just because, you may be dealing with some magistrate somewhere. He's a civil magistrate who just happens to be the one that's in power, although wisdom in front of that magistrate would be a good idea too. It's bigger than that, because on either side of that coin for an Israelite, God has an oath to the king and you have an oath to God. So when you go into the king, you better obey, you better keep his commandment. Okay? Verse number 3 then gives another piece of advice. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Okay? I think there's chapter 10. I just held up 4 fingers for 10. How about that? That is high quality right there. I did that because of what comes next. Chapter 10 and verse number 4. Okay? Couldn't hold up 10 fingers because I had my hand and glasses in my other hand, so I couldn't do it. I was restricted. Chapter 10, verse number 4. Somebody read that one for us, please.
If the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position, because composure obeys great offenses.
Okay, not exactly the same language, but a very similar idea 2 chapters later, right? When you're in front of the king, and the king gets angry at you or something like that, if it's not going the way you want to, you might be tempted to just try and run out of there. Solomon says here, and then same idea in chapter 10 is it's going to be better if you hang out there and try and get on the king's good side. Okay? It's going to make it better. And he then goes on to that where he says, do not take your stand in an evil cause. All right? ESV translate that evil. I think other translations translate it bad. Either kind of works. I think in this instance, again, from an expositional point, it matters whether the proper translation is evil or bad, but from an application standpoint, it doesn't really matter that whole much. If you're doing evil in front of the king, that's a bad idea. But maybe the idea is just not necessarily evil. Maybe the idea is just, well, stupid. Maybe it's just a bad idea. Okay? The problem is, if the king doesn't like your idea, whether it's evil or bad, the king is probably not going to make a whole lot of distinction in the English translation of that Hebrew word. The king's going to think they're both evil or they're both bad. So that's why I say it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference in terms of the English translation which one's proper. Okay? If you're taking your stand in front of the king, boy, you'd better make sure the cause is worthwhile. Make sure it's a good thing to be standing for. Either a good idea, yes, sir.
Well, also, if you fast forward a couple of hundred years, like the time of Jeremiah, everybody advising the king was saying the wrong thing.
That's true.
And so the king couldn't hear the choosers, and that he wasn't smart enough to choose the wrong thing.
That happened. That's a good point. Because, yeah. So, but just be careful of your language in front of the king. Okay? And then he says, kind of get to the reason. We've kind of hinted at the reason, but verse 4 gives you the reason for all this. For the word of the king is supreme. That's kind of the definition of the word king, isn't it? His word is supreme. He kind of gets to have his way. It's good to be the king. And he then says, the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? you might, if that's in your job description, you may want to seek a different job. Look in ESV gives a cross-reference in its margin of Daniel chapter 4, verse 35. I'll just go ahead and read it. Daniel 4:35. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Same idea. Okay, that language again, not just unique to Solomon, but here is the rulership, the authority, the sovereignty of the king. He wants something done. You're there either giving your counsel about it or you have to go out and do it. Boy, it's going to be a whole lot smarter to say yes. If you're going to say no, you better understand. And don't be hasty. So don't be very careful. Be wise when you go in. So then in verse 5, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, until the king realizes that the idea was bad, and then he blames not himself, but he blames the person that carried out his bad idea. That's not in this text. I just made that up, but I think that's probably true. Okay? You keep the command, you're not going to know anything evil. You're going to make the king happy. And the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. Again, that ESV gives a marginal note, which I think is helpful here. He will know the proper time and the judgment. Some translations will use the phrase there, if I'm not mistaken, procedure. You will know the proper time and procedure. Okay? So the ESV is rendering it just way. If you're using the ESV, that awfully sounds like if you're the wise man and you're in front of the king, you're going to know the way that is. When we read the word just way, who do we think of? Well, we kind of think of God. And I don't think that's the gist here. I think it's the word procedure. You nodded your head, yes. You said when I said procedure.
Yes, proper time and procedure.
What translation is it? New American Standard or New American? New American. Thank you. I didn't write that down. I knew somebody said it, but I didn't write it down. New American Standard. I like that rendering. I don't know if it's better with the Hebrew or not, but I like that rendering in terms of understanding the verse. Because if you're in front of the king and you're being wise, and you're trying to do what the king wants, and you fulfill that task, you don't know anything evil, and guess what you just figured out? The proper time and the method, the procedure for making your king happy. You're getting experience on the job, okay? I think that's the gist of the verse that's here. So that I don't know that that verse is necessarily all the way true from a theological standpoint, but for what Solomon is discussing, he just gave some really good advice. Okay, most kings are going to be more happy with yes men than no men, would be the way you should go at it. But he says, for there is a time, in verse number 6, there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. Okay? That's that same word misery that we've come across a couple of times already. It's just repeated here in verse number 6. There is a time and a way for everything. I don't know at this point if he's looking back to chapter 3 and that long list of things that is there, because he's talking here, I think, primarily about the king and not necessarily about the things that God has set up, but at least from maybe an ideological approach, there is a consistency to the conception here. When you're dealing with God, there's a time and a season for everything under heaven, under the sun. Guess what? When you're dealing with the king and you've learned the procedures and you've learned the proper time for everything, guess what you just figured out? Well, you've got there's a time and a way for everything. However, it doesn't remove your troubles from you. The misery that you're suffering under, all of those things, it's not like it goes away, it's still there. By being wise, you haven't removed evil. That's not really the thought necessarily fully here, but it's coming in the verses that follow. You haven't fully removed evil, but guess what? You've done at least a little bit. You may have delayed the time when it comes and gets you. Okay? So, and it still lies heavy on you. Okay? And then it says, we're back to our thought here, for he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him? ESV renders it how it will be. This one I did note, I hope I got it right. I believe the NASB translates it something along the lines of who can tell him when it will be. Okay? Again, in the Hebrew, I'm not sure which one of those is right. I like the NASB's rendering from an expositional standpoint and trying to explain the verse, because that's what we're dealing with, the proper time and the proper procedure. By doing right before the king, we have found that there's a time and a way for everything. I don't know what's going to happen, because guess what? Somebody can't tell me what's coming and either how or when that thing is coming. Because that gets back to the theme of chapters 7 and 8. I'm searching and I'm searching, trying to figure things out, and the thing I figured out is basically man can't know. You can't know exactly. You may know that there's a proper procedure. You may know that there's a way to get through these things, but you don't necessarily know when or how, well, ultimately, this thing's going to fail. All right? So then, verse number 8. No man has power. Now, hold on. Let me say about verse 8. We got about 4 phrases here. You can certainly take them individually. I think that's right. But I do believe that you're dealing here with kind of a summary type verse. I don't know that there's a specific argument coming from each one of these, other than the fact that what he just said in verse 7, you can't know what's coming and when, and here's the reason you can't. Because, verse 9, you do not have the power to retain your spirit. Okay? You don't. When that time comes, guess what happens to your spirit? It's gone. Okay? It's just gone. And when you're under the sun, which is the scope of this book, I mean, when we think about our spirits going away, what do we think of? Well, we think of heaven, and we think of our reward and our inheritance and all of that, and while we're sad about a loved one leaving, if that loved one is a Christian, it's not fatal to our own demeanor. It hurts a lot, but we at least have the hope, right? We have that understanding. I don't think that's Solomon's point here, because he's looking under the sun. You can't stop this from happening. And then he says, or power over the day of death. And so there's that kind of parallel structure. So I don't think he's talking about two separate things here. That's kind of the same thing. Spirit's leaving, power over death. Spirit leaving, Genesis, I just made up that verse. Boy, 35:18 is sticking in my brain. When Rachel gives birth to Benjamin, she was dying for her soul, or some translations soul, some spirit, I believe. Her spirit was departing. I think, Ken Turn. He's going to see if I'm right at 35:18. I could be just wrong there altogether.
35:18. It came about as her soul was departed. She died.
There you go. Oh. Benoni. Yeah, because the one time that somebody was telling me the other day they're going to start calling him Benjamin Benoni all the time. I don't remember who did that to me, but somebody did, and I'm like, all right, you can go right ahead. Nobody don't know who you're talking about, but if you want to be the Bible nerd, go right ahead, be that one. So that's the idea. Souls departing. That's the point of death, and so he says it here. You don't have the power to return your spirit, nor the power over death. Then he says, in the second half of the verse, there is no discharge from war. Okay? I'm not sure if there's a connection here to the overall thought of the chapter or not, or if he's just giving generic things. Because if somebody wants to engage you in war, guess what you're about to do? You're about to engage in war, because that's the way that works. Okay? Within the context of this passage, he's talking about a man in the presence of his king. And if your king decides it's time to go to war and he wants you, guess what? You're about to go to war. Nothing you can do about it. Okay? So I don't know if this phrase is generic or specific to the context. I can't tell. To me, again, it's one of those phrases that kind of works either way you look at it, because whether it's generic or specific to the context, same thing's true. When war comes, the fight's coming. You can't discharge yourself from it. And then, the second part of that, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All right? Can't go the other direction. Go down the path of wickedness and get away with all of the problems. All right? And so then he says in verse 9, he says, all this I observed. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun. Okay? This is, again, my conclusion. Now, we just saw that, what was it, back up in chapter, I think we just read it together a little bit a second ago, 27, about seeking to add one thing to another. My soul has sought repeatedly. 29, this alone I found. Same thought here, chapter 9, or chapter 8, verse 9. All this I observed. You can go all the way back to chapter 1, where he says, I applied my heart to know these things. So once again, Solomon's coming back to that thought. He says, all this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun. Once again, there is the scope of what he has in mind. And he says, when a man had power over man to his hurt. Okay? Another verse where the language, I think, probably could be rightly applied in multiple ways, because Solomon in verse 9 turns to the more generic phraseology. He refers to, at the end of verse 9, when man had power over man. Okay? And then he uses, in any English translation, he uses the singular masculine pronoun his to describe his hurt. I don't know that I can prove this, but I think this is kind of a conclusion to what he has just brought in. Because all the way back up at the beginning of this paragraph, as you want to call it, up in verse 2, The man that is first brought in that has power over the other man is the king. And so I think, hear the way I say that, I think the first man listed at the second half of 9 who has power over the man, or over man, is probably the king that has been the focal point of this whole paragraph. Now, he has power over man to do what? To do whatever he wants to that man, whether it hurts that man or not. The king is using that man for the king's gratification. Okay? And so he says, this is what I observed. When the king has power over the man, this is what's going to happen. Now, that might make you think, if you go with that connection, I suppose you could then argue that all the phrases in verse number 8 are tied to your service of the king, in which case that would make them perhaps more specific than generic. If you're in service of the king, you can't control when that service is going to send you to war. You can't control, you can't get out of it by being wicked. You can't, all that stuff. That's possible. But those things are still all true in the generic anyway. So I'm trying my best not to help y'all at all with this chapter tonight. Just any way you want to. That's the fun of a poetic book. Sometimes you get there and you're like, I think I know what it's talking about, but it's not a narrative. Okay, this is not a legal document. It's a poetic book using imagery to express an idea. I think the idea is pretty simple. The specifics of the verses, if you want to disagree with me, well, give me 30 seconds and I might agree with you, and then 30 seconds later I'll probably disagree with you again. How about that? Yes, sir.
The New King James throws in one word and flips that on its head.
Okay. I didn't read the New King James today. What's it say?
Time in which one man, we're talking about the king,
Yep.
rules over another man to his own hurt.
To the king's own hurt.
King's own hurt.
Okay.
There was another place, when it said the war, it said that war. Not just, you will not escape the war, but
Okay.
not escape that war, which then would refer you back to the verses just before that.
Okay. No, you're good. No, you're good there, because like I said, it's why I said way back in the introduction of the book of Ecclesiastes, you can spend a whole lot of your time just reading all of the translational differences and some of the commentary differences. I don't remember where I read it, but one of the commentators I read today in studying about it actually wanted to, I think it was the second, instead of his own hurt, I think he thought it should be translated their own hurt. So he has power over man for their own hurt. But that makes it plural and kind of changes the whole thought. I don't know. Okay, I don't know. However, the general idea I think is pretty simple. Okay, basically what he's saying here is, this is what I observed. And what I've observed is wisdom is better, but it doesn't solve all of the dilemmas facing you. You may have to go to war. You can't control when you're going to die. You can't control your outcome even by doing good or evil. It's just going to come. All right? So then, verse 10. Need to move along some here. He says, I then saw the wicked buried. All right? Now, keep in mind, as we've already noted, Solomon has already mentioned kind of what we sang tonight as we were singing about people that are doing evil and how they seem to prosper and be doing well. That in chapter 7, we talked about that law of retribution that the Jews thought, that a lot of ancients thought would happen. If you died early, it's because God brought judgment. Okay? But Solomon has already noted, as we study through chapter 7 and preceding chapters, that that's not always the case. He's going to bring it back up here to a degree. He says, but I did see a day when the wicked was buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is evil. So they used to go in and out of the holy place. Well, he doesn't use the term temple, but at least not in the ESV translation. But in the king over Jerusalem, and if indeed it is Solomon, which I think it has to be, what had he just built? Or perhaps, depending on when you date it, what was he in the process of building? Well, the temple.
And he said, these wicked people, man, they used to just go down to the temple and back. And inside the city, he says, they were even praised, okay, when they had done such things. There's another variation there if you want to think about it, but I'll skip it for now. But, so there he says of the wicked. And he says here in verse number 11, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily. All right? Now, there are any number of passages throughout the Old Testament, and actually a couple even in the New Testament. 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about God is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but he is holding off on some things, hoping that you will all come to repentance. So the idea that God is withholding judgment, that's just one New Testament verse. There are probably half a dozen verses in the Old Testament you could grab. ESV has on its cross references about 6 or 7 verses you can look at on your own that say exactly the same thing. Okay? But he says, because that is not executed speedily, the second half of verse 11, the heart of the child of man is fully set to do evil. Okay? Same idea back at chapter 7, verse 29, the end of that chapter. God set man upright, but what's man have? All kind of schemes to do all kind of things. Part of the reason for that is there's no judgment being executed, certainly not speedily. You seen all these people recently protesting the use of oil and all that stuff? Like parking themselves across the road, all kind of stuff. You know why they've done that more than once? It's a real easy solution to that. Nothing happened to them. Just that one semi come rolling through there and not stop. Might change. might change. Or let the police do their jobs. It might change what happens. Okay, that's just one thing. I was watching something on the news the other day. I don't even remember the details. Some dude, I guess, just got executed or just got his last appeal for execution suspended because in 1924 he's still on death row because back in the 1980s sometime, 40-something years, the guy's been in prison because he sexually abused and then murdered an underage teenage girl. And her parents were still alive, and they were like, the clip I showed them like at the guy's last appeal thing or doing something. I'm like, for real? This dude has been drawing breath, and we've been feeding this dude for 40 years? I mean, it didn't even sound like, at least the way the news presented it, didn't even sound like it was one of those where it might be in question, there might be some kind of thing. I'm like, that shouldn't take 40 years, that ought to take like 40 minutes because we need to find the rope the right length. I mean, but same idea here, okay? Because they get away with it, well, guess what people think? So nothing's changed, okay? It's a good sermon verse because nothing's changed then till now. Nothing's changed with what man does, okay? So he then says in verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, okay? Chapter 7, verse 15, same kind of thing, talks about that same kind of man prolonging his life in his evil doing. Largely, I think that's just the avoidance of judgment from it. I don't know that he means that he prolongs his life longer than it was going to be by not doing evil. I guess that's possible. But I think what he's actually talking about is the fact that he's doing evil so well that he's skipping the judgment that should be coming upon him and killing him at an early age. Okay? But then Solomon says, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked. Neither will he prolong his days like a shadow because he does not fear before God. Okay? So there you go. There is that great thought. Moving on, verse 14, because we got 5 minutes left. Verse 14 starts by saying this is vanity. Look at the last phrase of verse 14. I said this is also vanity. So just like the whole chapter begins and ends at the same point or the same themes, this verse does too. That takes place on earth. That there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. So while he just stated, I know that this is true, that God is over the wicked and over the righteous too, and he has confidence in the sovereignty of God, he then turns that back around and he says, yes, but I know this is vanity. Because while I trust in the overall view of God on this matter, guess what I can't answer the problem that I have, is that this contradiction continues to exist. It continues to be a problem. So then he says, as you get to the conclusion of the chapter, back to a theme we've had over and again throughout the book, all the way back in, chapter 3, I think was one of the earliest times it came up, maybe end of chapter 2, maybe. He says, I commend joy. So here is Solomon's conclusion. Wisdom is better, but as we're going to see in a second again, you can't find out where you go. How do you handle that there is this contradiction? The wicked sometimes live the righteous life or the righteous benefits. Sometimes the righteous go the wicked path. Wisdom is better in front of the king than being a fool, but you can't avoid all the things that are coming. What do you do? So here's your life lesson under Solomon's view right here. He says, I commend joy. For man has nothing better under the sun but to eat, drink, and be joyful. Okay? I don't think he's talking like a hedonist here in the fullness of that thought. But he is saying, here's what you need to do. Instead of trying to figure out all the things that are way off in the future which you cannot know, find the joy that you have right now. Enjoy that moment. Enjoy what you're eating. Enjoy what you're drinking. Be joyful in the moment. And then it says, for this will go with him. Okay? In his toil through all the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. Very similar language that you get back in chapter 2 and 3 as we're looking at the seasons and the times that are there. Solomon comes back to the same exact conclusion. I don't have an overall big answer to the problem, but I know the best way to get through the problem. To handle the problem day in, day out, is to find the thing today that is joyful. Okay? And then he says, verse 16, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see business done on the earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes sleep. Okay? Don't have the time because we're near the bell, but we've had that thought before. Even Solomon talked earlier in the chapters, if you remember, talking about the poor man and the rich man and all the things that can cause problems when one person is trying to sleep and so on. He says there's no way to get rid of this, well, to use the language of chapter 2, I guess it is, where he has put eternity into our hearts. You can't get rid of that. So there's never going to be a time where this question that he's just trying to figure out, he says you're not going to get rid of it. Even sleep is not going to solve all of your problems, because you're going to wake up the next morning, eventually you're going to have the same thought again. Why am I doing everything that I'm doing? Find joy in that moment. And then he said, then I saw all the work of God. That's why you're not going to be able to solve this, because all the way back to chapter 3, God's put these things in reason. What's been crooked you can't make straight. I saw the work of God. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find out. So don't waste your life spending time trying to figure out what God is doing. Go find joy in the thing, in the day, in the moment, in the event that God has given you. Okay? Now, there's wisdom in that, certainly. Even today, there are times going on in our lives where we don't know answers to everything we'd like to know answers to. Is that right? Okay? Sure. So instead of worrying about things that may or may not happen 6 months or a year or 10 years from now, because you may not live that long, enjoy the moment. However, Solomon's underlying problem here is wrong. Because like Isaiah 55 says, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. The problem is Isaiah 55 even acknowledges the fact that I've sent my word and it will accomplish that for which I've sent it. And part of what I have sent it for is that you can buy the truth and not sell it. We have a fullness of revelation that Solomon does not have. So while this is absolutely a good biblical thought and right to Solomon's conclusion, always keep in mind when studying in Ecclesiastes, this book is short of the fullness of the revelation of the gospel, because Solomon doesn't have it yet. So this is a good piece of advice. Find joy in your life when you can, because every good thing that comes down from above is from God. Okay? So even a wise man, you may think you've got everything figured out. Solomon ends chapter 9 by saying he cannot find out. Okay? The heading of chapter 9 means we're going to have fun next week. Did you see the heading of chapter 9 there? Death comes to all. So, hopefully not this week. I want all of y'all back. I want to be back next week. Let me start there. All right, let's stop and...
Father, we thank you so much for this day, these lessons. Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come and to be with our brothers and sisters, to go over your word. We thank you for Brother Jonathan and his studies, his preparation and knowledge. We pray that we'd all be better students, that we come to greater understandings of your word, and apply the truths into our lives to be more pleasing in your sight. Father, we pray for those that have been mentioned and others that you know of that have special needs in their lives this evening. We pray that you be with each and every one of them. Father, we pray that as we go our separate ways, that you would be with us, Father, that we would be with you, that we would be the lights into the world you call us to be. We pray for your forgiveness when we fall short. We pray, God, always strive and grow stronger. We pray all these things